welcome to Heliotropes. My name's Julia.
And my name's Kwadjo.
And today we are going to be defining our political landscape. So Kwadjo and I use a lot of political terms in our podcast. We're very happy to be back. So we thought that it would be helpful to define a lot of those terms, and perhaps we should have done this weeks ago.
Yeah. This is part one of a several-part project that we're going to be doing. Today we're starting, originally it was going to be like everything in one episode, but there's a lot, needless to say. So today we're going to be exploring the ideology around our political landscape. Next time we're going to get into the institutions that are built around those ideologies. And then we're going to get into the process of how these, institutions work, how American government works, essentially. Real quick plug, before we go any further. Shout out to Maryam Ahmad, who is running for DeKalb County Super District 6 Commissioner. The elections are on August 11th, the runoff elections for these positions. So make sure you go to the polls. Make sure you vote for people who deserve your votes. Don't just vote for, schmucks. And definitely vote for Maryam, because Maryam's the business. But not like business. Maryam will get things done. She's for the people.
For the people.
Yeah. So, without further ado, let's dive in.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to start with these?
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to start with defining republicanism and democracy. And so republicanism, and we're talking about the idea of what it means to live in a republic, to have a republic government. And that includes having a head of state, which is not a monarch, and present day, that's typically a president. And in a republic government, that means that...
It's been a while.
Yeah. It's ruling by the citizen body through means of representatives who those citizens voted for and who are meant to represent the interest of those who elected them, right? So voting's an important component, as are the representatives. And the idea is that sovereignty rests with the citizens. And so that can also be problematic because that depends on how citizens are defined, right? And we've explored that in some of our previous podcasts. And how the representative bodies are structured as well. For instance, if you have the same number of representatives from every single state, like in the United States.
The United States Senate.
Right. That doesn't represent the citizen body, right? You think about California and North Dakota. And if they have the same number of senators, that's not a representative government.
And, just a real quick note there. I've got to stop saying that. But that idea, what Julia just pointed out as far as how the Senate itself as a structure, and this is something obviously we'll get to in a future podcast, but that two-person representation from every state, this is a classist thing. The Senate itself is designed to subvert that, Republican structure that Julia just mentioned in a classist way, because you have the House that does have proportional representation, right? But they're like, okay, well, if people actually get a vote, how do we put a check on that? So we'll have the Senate happen, where we'll get two people from every state, subvert that proportional representation, and then also make the Senate the chamber that people have to go through to get things done, they have the final say, so.
Okay. The next kind of government that we're going to talk about is a democracy, which is often, right, what people in the United States believe and are taught that we live in this country. So in a democracy, it's the rule of the majority. So the government of the people who exercise their power directly or indirectly through a system of representation that's usually chosen during periodically held free elections, right? So on the face of it, it sounds like that's what the United States is. However, when you consider the rule of the majority, we don't actually operate that way, right? We depend on our representatives who, as we just mentioned, are not necessarily representative of the entire citizen body. And we also don't directly participate in majority rule, at least not in all of the decisions that are made.
Right. And this is, 2016 election, Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote, Donald Trump wins the electoral vote. The Electoral College is a really good example that we'll get into in the future.
And there are different kinds of democracies and different kinds of republics as well. So that's just kind of a brief definition.
Right. And then, the final definition is freedom. And it's important to consider what freedom is because it's thrown around so many times. It's thrown around in the Constitution, it's thrown around in the Declaration of Independence, thrown around in, casual discourse as well as more serious and formal political discourse. But, here we're just going with the Oxford Dictionary definition of freedom. There's 3 that we're going to get to. 1, freedom is the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. Quote, we do have some freedom of choice, right? So that's like the freedom of speech, First Amendment stuff, freedom to assemble, freedom, blah, blah, blah. Second definition is the absence of subjection to foreign domination or despotic government. He was a champion of Irish freedom, right? So in that sense, we have, Americans are free as long as we're not being controlled by a foreign power. Enter Russia and China and all that other, stuff. And then third, freedom is the state of not being imprisoned or enslaved, which kind of speaks for itself. It's, it's like, black people were freed after, the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's, well, what do you have to complain about? And the major thing to point out here is, one, how subjective of a notion freedom is and how loosely it's applied, right? You can pretty much use freedom to any end in any conversation, right? And then the thing to keep in mind with those 3 definitions is how relatively narrow they are and how they leave so much room for that kind of manipulation of ideas. Mm-hmm. So, now we're getting to the political spectrum. And when we talk about ideology in our political landscape, what we're talking about is the political spectrum. We have the left and we have the right. So anytime we're talking about ideology in the political spectrum, typically it's referred to in terms of the left-right nomenclature. You have the left and you have the right. And today, for the sake of mnemonics and simplicity in coding, Julia's going to be discussing issues on the left and what the left is, what ideologies align with the left. I'm going to be discussing the same thing on the right. So to start with our discussion of the political ideology and the political landscape of the United States, of American politics, we're going to get a sense of the left, what exactly it means to be on the left, what exactly it means to be on the right, and we're going to take it back to the origins of that terminology, at least as far as is popularly understood. So, if you've ever wondered where left-right came from, center, look no further. Check our sources, but we're going to tell you what we came across. So the terminology allegedly goes back to 1971 when during the National Assembly of the French monarchical government gathered, and they were deciding essentially where they stood on certain, essentially on their allegiance to the king. So the innovators, according to Wikipedia, the innovators were asked to stand to the left of the king, right? While those who were loyal to the king, who wanted to maintain the rule of the monarch, were asked to stand to the right. And it's really as simple as that. The left and right literally came from a simple voting mechanism, right? It was that they were asked to stand there to count their votes. People who were loyal to the king, wanted to conserve the power of the king, stood to the right. People who wanted to explore other forms of government stood to the left. So that's it. And then slowly from there on, the terminology was adopted throughout Western politics. It was adopted in the early 20th century by the Bolsheviks. It was adopted in the United States around the 60s, 70s. And in each case, it typically coincided with an increasing polarization of politics, to the point that there's a left and a right. So, the right side of the spectrum, per the 1971 anecdote, signifies views rooted in traditional or conventional authority, aka the status quo. While the left side of the spectrum hosts more unconventional views. On both sides, these include ideologies, policies, cultural norms, agendas, etc. Right? So there's a lot contained in all of these. The center is used to denote a middle space between the left and the right poles, either as a specific idea considered moderate, or as a person or group who hold beliefs on both poles which roughly balance out. Okay, so I mean that's the idea of the left-right dichotomy, and it's important to note that because of the nature of the left-right spectrum, the right identifying with an often narrow sense of tradition, and the left deviating in almost any direction from said conventionality, it's important to note that the diversity of the ideologies and approaches embodied on the left is almost always much broader than the swath of perspectives represented on the right. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, because it's often referred to, conservatives, the right in America. It's easier to appeal to those voters because you know exactly what they want, because they're a relatively small group of people who are just really passionate about voting, versus the left, which you see all this infighting all the time because there's so many different ideas represented, and then also so many different ways of manifesting those ideas.
So as Kwadjo just mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the left. So the political left, similar to what Kwadjo said, tends toward changing ideas and norms to be more inclusive of changing language and identities, right? So it's the side that wants to explore other options as opposed to what is currently happening in terms of how people are being governed. So there's often more openness to non-traditional thought and values, and in current US politics, the political left has shifted to the center now, closing the space between the political right and the left. So left positions have become consumed in capitalist ideologies and power, often using the same fear tactics as the right to advance what they believe are morally superior ideas. It's important to note that true left politics and the two-party U.S. system, those that call for things like universal health care and living wages and the end of capitalism, would be considered centrist politics in other countries. So the left is often synonymous with liberalism, but as I just mentioned, it's important to think about, right, like the ideology of the left and what it's supposed to mean, what it's come to mean, and what that means in other parts of the world as compared to what it means in the U.S. Do you want me to talk about liberalism now, or do you want to? Okay. So liberalism is an Enlightenment ideal emphasizing the supremacy of individual liberties over big state monarchical structures. So it's clear that this is a leftist political stance because it was anti-government and provided an imposing political belief. So characteristics of liberalism include big government, which means government deficit spending to provide social welfare programs and other things that would really, benefit and uplift people's lives that have been damaged by the previous governments. It also means increased taxes, right, to support that programming. Cultural liberalism includes multicultural elitism and internationalism, which brings up this kind of like struggle and probably has links to neoliberalism if we're going to talk more about that. But this idea of internationalism, I think, is an important one. It views oneself as part of the global society and the country as part of a global community, as opposed to, like your kind of individual self just meandering around in your own world, only being concerned about what's contained in that space. It also includes the belief in the power of macro-social constructs to affect the individual. So liberal politics often includes scapegoating their own role in badness in this country. That's to say that they oversimplify issues and blame specific people and incidents for poor societal conditions. So we have seen a lot of that been going on over the past few years. So the preoccupation with getting Trump out of the White House instead of having a platform that will provide societal conditions for equity, freedom, and safety, which is an ultimate betrayal of liberalism itself, which is an ongoing thread among leftist political ideologies that we're going to share today, right? This idea of like betraying the ideology that you're saying you are manifesting in your politics. And the ones that we're going to talk about today or that I'm going to share about, are socialism, communism, and anarchy, though there aren't clear current examples of anarchy, as you can probably imagine. But each of them provide an alternative to the current two-party democratic, or is it a democratic system, in the United States.
So, shifting over to the right, as noted earlier, the political right tends toward traditional ideas, norms, and conventions. This comes down to preserving a current status quo or restoring a prior status quo, hence the whole "Make America Great Again" quote. Per the French Revolution example, those on the right of the king were in favor of restoring the monarchical rule which governed France for centuries prior. In contemporary U.S. politics, the political right is embodied in economic and social terms in the conservative identity. Conservatives are the right. They're the most prominent group on the American political right. U.S. economic or fiscal conservatism features the idea of small government. So contrary to the liberal idea of big government, small government, which is to say a small federal government is preferable to a large one so as not to infringe on the rights of individual states to determine their own affairs. Conservatism manifests in American politics in organizations like the Federalist Society, which trains lawyers and judges in a textual interpretation of the Constitution, which is where this idea of small government comes from. Taken from their website, here's a quote, they believe, among other things, that it, quote, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what the law should be." All right? End quote. That's textbook conservatism. Here's some further supporting. 5 of the current 9 Supreme Court justices are current or former members of the Federalist Society, as well as countless judges appointed to federal appellate and district courts. Prominent Republican congresspeople, including Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, senators, current and former White House staff, etc. So the Federalist Society and in general conservative, like the elite conservative viewpoint, is well represented in our government today, which is something you can expect from generally any Republican administration. Mm-hmm. Small government, or any Republican administration since the 1980s. Small government in policy largely means things like reducing government spending, tax cuts, balancing budgets, economic protectionism, etc. And this is all in rhetoric. It doesn't always or rarely apply in practice in the way that people think it does. Social welfare programs are stigmatized because they are seen as frivolous government spending. Global trade is seen as happening at the expense of domestic workers, and taxes are generally thought of as terrible. In the current economic landscape, the only people who really benefit from fiscal conservatism are wealthy families who occupy higher tax brackets and are funded enough to afford the legal loopholes imposed by conservative policies. So, this is fiscal conservatism. We're going to get into social and cultural conservatism right here, being that is what most people are familiar with when they think of conservatism. So, what is it? The sociocultural landscape with which American conservatives tend to concern themselves is defined by 2 main forces: Protestant Christianity and the idea of American exceptionalism. Both ideological mainstays in the American self-concept and thus the status quo, which is why they're on the right. Protestant values such as the Protestant work ethic support the bootstrap narrative of American success, which reinforces conservative antipathy toward social welfare programs, thus affirming, without this contradiction, that their belief in small government is justified. So, essentially, the bridge between Southern Protestantism and conservative policy is essentially, God helps those who help themselves. In policy, they're like, let's make that policy. So, other ways of conserving, or rather ways of conserving cultural norms. And I say conserving because, again, that's a way to think of conservatism and what it is as, conserving the status quo. Ways of doing that include advocating for closed borders or advocating for assimilation into white American culture as a precondition for immigration. That is, learning and speaking fluent English, adopting an overtly patriotic stance towards the U.S., etc. Celebrating status quo American history and refraining from challenging existing, often whitewashed historical narratives. Supporting supporting traditional economic industries such as coal, oil, and agriculture, and adopting compatible religious values and beliefs like anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage, and general religious preferentialism, i.e., a Christian storekeeper should have the right to turn away customers on religious grounds, like, if you don't believe that gay people should be married, then you can turn them away from your store. But a Muslim or a Jewish storekeeper should not necessarily have the same right or be able to exercise it in the same way, right? That's religious preferentialism. Saying the pledge of, right?
Putting, under God.
Yeah. Keeping that part of the Pledge of Allegiance in, and making it mandatory to say it in schools, religious preferentialism. Teaching creationism in schools, public schools, religious preferentialism.
Or making the United States motto, "In God We Trust."
Right.
Religious preferentialism,
Right.
which almost everyone voted for.
Or starting the school day or the work day with prayer. All religious preferentialism because, Anyway, the point is, there's a separation of church and state in the Constitution, and I'm not going to get into that. But likewise, social development outside of this paradigm, this conservative paradigm, tends to net a backlash from conservatives who feel that not only are things changing too much, but that they are changing in such a way as to leave them out of the progress, right? So it's an interesting idea of, wait, we don't like that things are changing, but also we see that some things are getting better for people, and we want in, and we're going to be upset that we're not a part of that. Progress. It is in the spirit of the general tendency toward preserving what is, or reaching to reclaim what was, again per MAGA, to which people refer when they identify cultural conservatives as xenophobic. So, 2 notes, and then we're going to go on to, Julie's going to take it from here. While all of the above are markers of American conservatism, not all self-identified conservatives subscribe to all of the values described above. And that is to say that while we do tend to associate conservatives with, things such as racism and xenophobia and like all of those other things, which understandably so, it's important to keep the ideology of conservatism separate from the consequences of conservatism, right? Because, in 50 years, if things go exactly the way we want things to go, we're not going to want those things to change anymore. We're going to be
conservatives.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind. And then another note is that while economic conservatism can be applied in more constitutional terms, the Constitution offers little explicit guidance on issues such as abortion, women's rights, gay rights, civil rights, etc. As such, many of the cultural prerogatives of the American right simultaneously demand big government intervention while challenging the very notion of constitutional conservatism. E.g., making abortion illegal, right? You need the government to step in to do that. That's an act of bigger government than is necessary, right? To do something that's not necessary. Or laws expanding police power and drug-related pursuits. Again, we're going against the Constitution to expand the power that the government has to pursue a drug war, which is largely unnecessary, if not entirely, really.
Especially because they started it.
Right, exactly. So this, in conjunction with the conservative right's support of the expansion of police and criminal sentencing powers well beyond what is popularly considered just, has led some observers, such as Noam Chomsky, to recognize that the contradictions within the American conservative identity more accurately described what is known as radical statism, which is it's not conservatism, again, because it calls for more government intervention in the daily lives of people, often in ways that involve brute force or like the heavy booted restriction of certain rights. And it's also important to note that this is a crucial stepping stone to fascism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like just in those brief introductions we gave, it's pretty easy to see how the current manifestations of all of the things our governmental representatives talk to us about are so far removed from the actual ideology,
right.
At least for probably like 90 or 95% of the things that they talk about and tell us that they're doing, which, keep your, senses out for all of the hypocrisy that is going on. And I think the point that you made about remembering like the ideological foundation is so important, because that's ultimately, right, like when you get into these conversations with people who have different viewpoints, right, like that's something to come back to and to hold on to. And what is it that people are conserving, or what is it that people are wanting to see be different? And those are could be some really insightful and or disturbing, which I suppose is the kind of insight answers.
Yeah, that's one of the things that you mentioned about liberalism that I want to point out to people is that the connection, right? Because in the definition, and we know this, but in the definition, right, you say that liberalism came about as an Enlightenment ideal against the monarch, against kings, and that form of big government. And today we associate liberalism with big government. So it seems like a paradox, but that comparison, that notion of liberalism literally came out of the New Deal. It was those regulations, those policies, those acts saving the economy, taking care of the American people who did not have the means to take care of themselves during the Great Depression, where the government stepped in and said, okay, we'll take care of you, right? We will look out for your personal best interest by giving you jobs and giving you money and giving you Social Security and taking care of you when you're old and taking care of you when you're sick. So again, it's one of those things like you just said, like if you're just sticking to the terms and how they're used and not paying attention to where they came from or what they actually mean on a deeper level, you're going to miss out on a whole lot of stuff, and a whole lot of stuff is not going to make sense to you. And consequently, it's going to be really easy to mislead you. So share this video with your friends.
I'm going to shift in to talking about some different types of governments and their ideological foundations. So I'm going to start with socialism, which is an economic and political theory that advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned and or regulated by the community as a whole or by the government. So there are a lot of different kinds of socialisms, or ways that it can be implemented and manifested. So you may remember hearing in history class that the workers, the proletariat class, should own the means of production and should not be exploited by and beholden to the bourgeoisie class, and that there should be an uprising, right, and a overturn and a shift in power. So there are many different kinds of socialism, and the main thread is collective or social ownership. So getting rid of, like, shifting the class structure significantly to diminish class structure, and really engaging the community in terms of ownership. So you may have heard the term socialism for the rich recently in relation to the CARES Act, and previously in relation to bailing out the auto and banking industries, which Obama did. And that term is referencing the many, many dollars that the government provided to those companies to help them, stay afloat. Or more accurately, that money went to help the CEOs maintain their obscene salaries and didn't actually, trickle down to the workers in any sort of way that was helpful to them, like you just mentioned, right? Like for individuals after the Great Depression. And the government reps use their power to facilitate government assistance for wealthy individuals and folks who mismanage their gigantic corporations, who exploit the working class to increase their profits. And so, like, think about the CARES Act, right? Like, the conservatives had that criticism in some ways of Obama, right? And now that it's a different administration during the CARES Act, the left or the liberals are having that same criticism against Trump, right? So I think that's one of those things about talking about what that language actually means is so important, despite potentially different circumstances and other things going on. Anyways, Amazon is a great example of the call for socialism that is happening currently. Jeff Bezos is worth about $181 billion. 181 billion with a B dollars. That is insane. I mean, that's so much money. And Amazon workers, right, are constantly been sharing stories of horrible working conditions, poor or no benefits, and living, like, I mean, non-livable wages, really, right? And then going on strike and trying to organize that and then getting fired. And now his exploitation of workers isn't his only or necessarily even his main way of hoarding wealth. But the stark contrast between what he gives to himself and what he provides his workers certainly contributes. And so thinking about socialism, and if the workers owned the means of production and distribution, there would be a much fairer breakdown of profit and many, many more people would have improved life conditions, while Jeff Bezos would still have a fine life, right? He just wouldn't have $181 billion.
Per everything Julia just shared, we're going to jump into capitalism. So before we get into fascism, I do want to talk about capitalism because capitalism is at the root of a lot of these things. It's at the root of our transition to socialism, essentially the root of our transition to communism. Because capitalism is a right concept, it's the base for, whatever comes after, heading towards the left. So now, a concept that is several hundred years old and just recently having achieved maturity, according to, many sources, capitalism in the West is now squarely a tenet of the Western status quo. Capitalism is a system of economic organization in which agents of the free market can exchange goods and services and accumulate wealth. It must be noted that in its maturity, which is what we see now, especially given the three major U.S. economic downturns in the past 20 years alone, capitalism has been shown to be ruthlessly exploitative in its truest free market form and difficult to regulate due to its penetrative tendency toward regulatory capture. For all the problems of capitalism, many, if not all of them, have been thoroughly normalized over the past 50 years in particular, helping to solidify its conceptual position in the status quo as something not to resist, but as something to celebrate, right? Thus, capitalism often receives stark economic and cultural defense from the conservative right. Capitalist ideals of agency, industry, and economic freedom align with the econo-religious notion of the Protestant work ethic. It's coming up a lot, right? Which posits that work for the sake of work is a virtue in and of itself, and that the accumulation of material worldly gains are evidence of God's favor. Can't make this stuff up. Well, someone made this stuff up. Yeah. Capitalists made this stuff up.
Fucking guys.
Thus, the limited upward mobility of the working class is justified by cultural and religious beliefs, and so is the success of the few who ascend the economic ladder on the labor and exploitation of the working masses below. Enter Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, the Walton family, etc., all the billionaires, Elon Musk, all of them. It's also worth noting how the belief that the ultra-wealthy are somehow ordained by God to be so wealthy spurs the working masses to defend their exploitation with an almost religious fervor, right? So it's not just like they're like, oh, I hear you, billionaires are bad. Or, billionaires, like, I hear you, but I still want to defend them. It's like, no, like they worked so hard for that and they deserve to have every dollar of that $1 billion that they can never possibly spend in their life while other people starve,
Yeah, it's just such a strongly held belief, right, that anybody can be a billionaire if they work hard enough in this country because capitalism, and I'm a capitalist and that's how I think it should happen, without a recognition of you're in fact much more likely to be homeless than you are, or houseless, and lose all of your money than you are to ever become a billionaire or probably a millionaire in your lifetime.
Yeah. Capitalism also manifests in conservative economics in a number of ways. Perhaps one of the most notable elements of policy positions favorable to capitalism lies in the concept of deregulation. In short, big government steps in to regulate capitalism, small government steps in to deregulate. It's important to note that either way, government is stepping in to do something. Going back to Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting and FDR's New Deal regulation of banks and the market, see the Glass-Steagall Act, you can look it up. Big government has occasionally stepped in to regulate capitalism, making the harsh realities of capitalism more tenable for workers and consumers by limiting the power corporations have over market forces. Conservatives argue that the free market is the ultimate self-regulating economic authority and that unregulated capitalism is the way to go. This is a dangerous and reckless idea, and it's unfounded unless you're making millions of dollars.
Very Lord of the Flies.
I guess. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the imagery works. Though this statement is demonstrably false, conservative lawmakers get paid tax dollars, your tax dollars, our tax dollars, to essentially do nothing to check the growth of big business. This was most recently seen in the congressional hearings of just last week, in which the heads of the largest big tech companies were grilled for hours by Congress on nothing related to their collective near monopolization of consumer data in the entire world, right? In summation, capitalism in this episode will be classified and described as a conservative ideology, as is evidenced in right-wing culture, policy, and rhetoric.
I think, like one of the things that's also really important to point out too, as I talked about the left and liberalism, how many of those folks are capitalists, right? And want to protect the capitalist system at all costs as well. So remember that it's not just conservatives who are protecting those ideas. So we're going to shift in to talk about communism now. So as I mentioned before, Marx and Engels believed in socialism as a transition from a capitalist society to a communist society. And communism advocates abolition of social class and a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid depending on ability and need. And it's often associated with an uprising and a revolution and, like a violent takeover by the working class of, the elite and the wealthy. So I do want to take a moment because communism in the United States and in many countries around the world has been given a bad name. And in the United States, I think it specifically has a bad name, at least kind of like from our generation thinking back, due to Russia, Mao, and China, and Cuba. And I mean, there's also a lot of other stuff going on with Cuba too. But their calls for class war and for a change in power from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. And we won't get into all of the politics here around, kind of the U.S. relationship with Russia, China, and Cuba during those times and currently. But it's important to consider the U.S. interests in bashing communism and those countries specifically. It's like a sweeping global movement of the working class taking over would have had and would still seriously interfere with, right, like the 1% and the wealth hoarding and the power and all of the things Kwadjo just talked about. So those revolutions were violent, which was used against the movement, right, which is, again, like very familiar to the U.S. in terms of how revolts and revolutions and change are expected and accepted to happen, which is through nonviolence and peaceful protest, which is never how they've ever happened. And they often did not end in the manifestation of the ideology itself, right? But in a need for continued power and hoarding resources and wealth for the new leaders, right, who are the working class folks who overthrew the wealthy folks. So these are the new leaders and their new loyal class, right? It often resulted in kind of hoarding material resources for those folks and elevating those folks to different levels of power. I mean, like, look up Mao. So please do your own research on these countries and on communism and the US's relationship. And I mean, there's a lot, right? Like, you go back 70 years now, right? Like, to the US jailing people that they thought were communists and making like really loose connections and, you know, using it in all these political ways, I think, for their own benefits. So do your own research, and especially on Cuba. And I have a soft spot for Cuba and all of, right, like the really effective and good things that were implemented by the revolutionaries there. And the United States has a supremely fucked up history with Cuba and with communism, as it's a direct threat to capitalism. And Cuba's geographic location to the U.S. made it very worrisome to the U.S. government. And they did some horrible, horrible things to Cuba that we never learn about in school, right? Because it doesn't serve the U.S. interest. So do some of your own research on those and be asking yourself who benefits from what narrative here, and why is communism viewed the way that it is in this country right now.
And just, you know, to get you a little primer, I mean, some of those horrible things include the economic sanctions that were lifted until the Obama term, right? So for decades they were under economic sanction. Ethno-specific biowarfare, Cuba was targets of that. We look at Guantanamo Bay and how that part of Cuba was annexed. And, you know, to this day, we still have prisoners in there trying to assassinate their leader, Fidel Castro, several times. Like, you know, the attempts never ended. And that's just like a piece of it, right? And each one of those things has like ripple effects that, you know, spread throughout.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like the biowarfare and how that destroyed the land and animals and the ability to eat and feed self and farm. And I mean, for decades, right? Like, that has such a significant shift on ecology and then how people like people's livelihoods.
Yeah. And then just to reiterate, you know, like a lot of people, again, have problems with like when they think about Cuba and, you know, the revolution, you know, Castro and Guevara, you know, like, you know, getting, I forget his name, out of the way, Batista, they cite the violence. They're like, you know, it's so violent, you know, they killed so many people, they had to, you know, whatever, like, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Which, you know, to which I would say, you know, keep in mind the history of your own country and like what we have done as a country to other nations and to what end, right? Like, we go in and massacre people and then also, you know, do the same thing here, right? And, you know, be really selective about who we give certain privileges to. Whereas Cuba went in and they said, okay, we're going to need to do all this violence to create a clean slate, and then we're going to do our best to raise the floor. And then when people think also about the pitfalls of that, the ways in which Cuba has been ineffective in like effectively implementing like that in raising the floor, do think about, as Julia said, all the ways in which we have interfered as a nation in their ability to do that, because none of that stuff can be taken out of that context of Western interference.
Yeah, and to the violence piece too, I would say that, you know, there's often like an avoidance or an unwillingness to discuss, right, what the previous leader was doing and their violence, whether it was, you know, like immediate and having people killed, or whether their hoarding of wealth and power and resources was slowly killing, you know, just a whole class of people, which you can make the argument for in this country as well, right? So that's often ignored, right? And because it's like, oh, well, they didn't peacefully do it. Like if the capitalists just surrendered everything, that would have been so much better. Yeah, right. Like, because who just surrenders their whole, pot of gold? Like, that's not something that happens. So, yeah, ideologically, like that piece that, the violent takeover piece is always going to be inherently against whoever is in power.
Right.
And unpleasant to them.
So jumping back over to the right, we're going to talk about fascism.
Hey!
And something I want to mention before I get into the rest of this fascism thing is, I thought it was interesting how, as we were coming up with the list of things to talk about on the left and on the right, with that disclaimer earlier, the right is typically defined by this much narrower scope because of where it comes from. It comes from tradition, it comes from the status quo, what you can see around you now, which is obviously, in so many ways more limited than what you can't see around you, right? If I'm only looking at this couch, then I'm not seeing the rest of the room, right? Looking at the couch is the right, and the rest of the room is the left. That being said, the list of things is comparable as far as the number of things, and then wondering why, I came to the conclusion that, even though the status quo is limited in comparison to what could be on the left, one, it's composed of a number of different ideologies that are very relevant, and two, it's important to note how the things that exist now can manifest to scale, right? So essentially, fascism, as we're about to get into, is an amplified version of conservatism, right? Neoliberalism, as we're going to get into, is an amplified version of capitalist conservatism, in a sense. So just keep that in mind. If you're like, they said that the left is much bigger than the right, but they have all of these things on the right. It's because there's a lot of different ways that what we're doing now can look less scary or more scary, depending on what portions of the present are amplified, like an equalizer, if you know music and stuff, audio. So, to fascism. Earlier, I noted the links between conservatism, radical statism, and fascism. While difficult to define and identify within exact parameters, fascism has been described by philosopher Slavoj Žižek as a conservative revolution from the right, while political prisoner George Jackson highlighted the intimate links between the capitalist U.S. state circa the 1970s and a fascist empire. These viewpoints effectively capture the nuance of a fascist state manifested here in the 21st century. Though popular around the world in the first half of the 20th century, and implemented in a number of different ways, like in Germany, in Japan, in a number of different ways and places, fascism was first conceived of by Benito Mussolini in 1925 Italy and refined to devastating effect, as we all know, by Hitler shortly thereafter in post-Weimar Germany, 1930s, 1940s. According to Britannica.com, the definition of fascism, or according to the Britannica.com definition of fascism, fascist regimes so named for the weapons of the Roman police force called fasces, which were bundles of sticks that they used to hit people, but also bundles of sticks that, if you take one out, it breaks, right? But if you keep them all together, it's strong. That's where fascism comes from as a name. Britannica.com says that as far as fascist governments, quote, they have, quote, many characteristics in common, including extreme militaristic nationalism, contempt for electoral democracy and political cultural liberalism, a belief in natural social hierarchy and the rules of elites, and the desire to create a Volksgemeinschaft, which is German for people's community, in which individual interests would be subordinated to the good of the nation. End quote. I won't go into a whole lot of detail about how closely that aligns with our current conservative state and presidential administration in particular. But the similarities are striking and always worth contemplating. And of special consideration here is not just how close we are to being an explicitly fascist state today, but also how close we were 5, 10, 20, and 40 years ago, and so on. So, in short, fascism can be conceived of as an ultra manifestation of conservatism, right? If conservatism gets everything it wants, it'll be fascism. And that's why it was important to go over capitalism immediately, because all of these fascist states were capitalist. Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Japan's, Koji's, Tojo's Japan, Emperor Hirohito and Prime Minister Tojo, they're all running capitalist enterprises. So when people think of, and that's one of the things I wanted to do in defining what fascism is how it differs from totalitarianism as a blanket ideology, how it differs from communist dictatorships. Because I remember that being a thing when I was in school. I was like, oh, okay, so Hitler was fascist, but Stalin was communist, and they were both dictators, but communism has a dictator, and fascism also has a dictator, but it's not communism, and I was so confused about all that stuff.
Yeah, so it was almost every history teacher who's teaching that stuff because it's incorrect. And that's right, that's also part of how you learn about how bad communism is, because oh my gosh, they killed tens of millions of people, and it's communism didn't though, right? That's always the thing, yeah.
And then also, so do we. But it's always
that.
Cast in a really nice light, we dropped a couple bombs on, Japan at the end of the war when we didn't need to see what would happen. But it was in the name of
science, exploration.
Exactly.
And so we wouldn't have to kill our own troops. We did it for the betterment of the people.
Of all mankind.
Yeah. I think, what you said about how close this country has been to fascism over the past however many years is striking and also terrifying, right? How close we keep getting, and maybe we take a step back from, and then we get there some more, and how it feels like that's always been kind of a line that folks are flirting with. And how quickly power can shift. And so probably we've even been a lot closer than we've ever thought that we were. And I think a lot of people feel that now, and I don't know what it's been kind of in those present moments, obviously, because I wasn't there, but it is kind of curious to think about, and it's really scary, and it kind of begs this question about how do you get away from flirting with this line, or is that part of how a democracy operates, that's always a possibility?
Right. I do think that I've become increasingly accepting of that side of human nature, because I think fascism is a reflection of a part of human nature. I think about and I'm sure I've referred to this quote before on the podcast, because ever since I heard it, it's one of those things that stuck with me. But it was FDR during his third term, I believe, towards the end of World War II. Addressing, the nation. He was in a crowd of people, and he had just won his third term or something, and the crowd cheered for him. They were so roaring from it, and he was like, wow, I forget what the quote exactly is, but it was something along the lines of, I knew in that moment that the people would have just kept voting for me, and they would have been fine having me as essentially their dictator, president ad perpetuum. Because it's important to keep in mind, after he won 3 terms, that's when, Congress was like, okay, presidents should only serve 2 terms now. Otherwise, we would have very reasonably elected into dictatorship or fascism FDR if he hadn't died. So.
And perhaps if he had a different attitude about it, instead of being like, wow, and was like, wow.
Yeah.
You
exactly.
know? Yikes.
People loved them. They're fascist dictators.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the thing, like you said.
They're always charismatic, right?
Yeah. Like Hitler was elected. You know, Trump was elected. FDR was elected several times.
Yeah. And always on similar platforms too, right? Of like, things are bad right now and I want to make things better, and this is my plan to make things better because this country deserves to have things better.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's always on this populist, charismatic for the people, right? Like people, dictators didn't start running being like, in the elections being like, I'm going to be a dictator and I'm going to fucking kill half of you or starve the rest of you or whatever else it might be. That's never, ever how it is. And they're often very charismatic.
Well, I wouldn't say it's never how it is.
I mean, in an election? Well, yeah. But
Hitler didn't... People knew about his anti-Semitism well before he was elected.
Right.
So it was a part of what they were voting for. And I'm really curious, like, how many Jewish people voted for Hitler?
Yeah. I mean, it's similar to Trump, right? Like, people knew about all of his isms before he was elected and thought he was still going to serve the best interests of the most amount of people. Right? And, like, that's what it is. It's like this significant departation from what was going on before, or departure. Departation.
Yeah, I was like, it sounds right.
Yeah, it did sound right. All right. Anyways, okay. Let's shift to anarchy. Hey! It's going to be a significant departation. So anarchy is a belief in the abolition of the state and all coercive and involuntary forms of hierarchy. It advocates for a voluntary and cooperative, socially organized community. So anarchy is often associated with chaos and violence, at least in this country, and from the folks who are always in power in the United States and perhaps in other countries as well. And it may sound like that when our minds and imaginations, right, are like beholden to the state and this idea of like that people, large groups of people necessitate order and some sort of hierarchy and structure. But it's important to remember that critiques that depict ideologies as bad, violent, chaotic, harmful, etc., without defining the ideologies or exploring them, serve a purpose to those in power who are sharing those beliefs. So when you think about anarchy, right, like think about that foundational, like the ideology of it is an abolition of the state because a belief that the state is harmful. Right, and like you think about the protests that are going on and how many people believe, right, like that the state is being harmful in terms of police brutality, or the fact that over 60% of the people in this country believe in Medicare for all and want Medicare for all, but the state won't allow that to happen, right? Like that's harmful. And so anarchy calls for like an abolition of all of that and people coming together and creating a consensus to kind of create their own communities. There are lots of different ways that anarchy kind of has taken shape in terms of free love and some other things that you can check out on your own. And I feel like there was something else I was going to mention and now I've lost it.
Which is exactly where I was before you jumped into anarchy. And I remembered. But it's appropriate because, I mean, it goes to what you said, pointed out about fascism, how fascist leaders rise to power with, a message and a platform of, I'm the one who can save you and I'm the one who can do this and take control of this. And, there's a question of, to the question of what do we do about fascism and how do we avoid that tendency? We avoid it by empowering people, and anarchy kind of demands by its nature that people be empowered at least enough to be able to take care of themselves and the ones they love. So I just wanted to point that out as a solution to fascism, right? Like states in which the people expect to be taken care of or not even expect to be taken care of, but expect not to be. States in which the people feel under constant threat are states that are highly vulnerable because there's a loss of agency, right? Whether that's through the government or outside exogenous forces, boom. So restoring that sense of agency, educating, the electorate, getting people out to vote, letting people know what the process is, and making sure people are familiar with that, giving people the tools to exercise their own self-interest, right? That's, how you be anti-fascist. That's how you, effectively apply an anarchical state. I guess anarchical state is paradoxical, but
and there wouldn't be all that voting and all that stuff because
right.
There wouldn't be a hierarchy. But I think oftentimes anarchists are likened to anti-fascists in this country and to Antifa, right? And Antifa is, there's lots of violence going on, right? And that's like the nature of it. So I think like people tie those together, right? Like this belief in like being an anti-fascist and against fascism, and versus this belief around like the abolition of the state, right? Like an anti-fascist could be a socialist or a communist or some other thing. Right. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're an anarchist. And
to your point about violence being in the nature of anti-fascism or Antifa, it's also important to note, if you didn't get it, that is because violence is in the nature of fascism, right? So it's resisting fascism, resisting a violent force through violence. Mm-hmm. And you can debate the merits of it, but if you're going to debate the merits of that, start with debating the merits of like the violence applied by the fascist forces. Right. Yeah, because you get rid of that, and you don't have the counter force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what we mentioned before with communism.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're jumping into imperialism. And again, this is one of those things, we started with conservatism. We hit capitalism as a central tenet of, conservatism and right-wing ideology. Then we went into fascism, and fascism is ultra conservatism taken to the max. You can also look at fascism as a capitalist dictatorship, okay, which is on the right. And here we have imperialism. And imperialism, in this, I'm essentially going to identify it as a global extension of capitalism, okay? So again, it's on the right. And for this quick explainer on imperialism, just know, again, that is anyway. It is a global extension of capitalism motivated by capitalism's drive for resource acquisition to sustain its otherwise unsustainable growth. As an extension of capitalism, imperialism typically involves the military or economic subversion of regional sovereignty, the replacement of local powers with mainland imperial agents, and the subsequent exploitation of the local population to capitalist ends. Just like capitalism is entrenched in effect in the lives of everyday Americans to merit it conservative status in this discussion, imperialism is also going to be covered as a conservative ideology given the dependence of the conservative public on the imperial status quo. Support of U.S. military operations as patriotic and necessary to spread freedom and democracy are mainstays of conservative sympathizing, and the close association of the U.S. military with U.S. national identity resonates closely with conservative notions of practicing patriotism. Okay, so keep all of that in mind. However, in the presence of imposed hegemonic cultural and political institutions, the cultural and physical distance from the hegemon and the denial of outright citizenship and full protection under the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, for conquered territories often leaves local residents of a territory highly vulnerable to the fullest ravages of both capitalism and imperialism. And in short, to the fullest ravages of the ideologies on the right side of the political spectrum. While U.S. imperialism has been a target of criticism by U.S. citizens that is to say, at the very least, since or earliest, easily since the aggressive implementation of the Monroe Doctrine. I'm going to start that over. While U.S. imperialism has been a target of criticism by U.S. citizens easily since the aggressive implementation of the Monroe Doctrine, which began in the 1800s, late 1800s, it has fallen largely out of vogue per mainstream liberal discourse over the recent years, paving the way for neoconservatism to supplant its vaguer antecedent, the vaguer antecedent being imperialism. That is to say, we still have imperialism, but it looks a little different, and it's different enough to be considered a different ideology, which is, again, an amplification of things that we've already covered, and we'll get to this soon. Jumping in, neoconservatism is an ideology pioneered by the Reagan administration in the 1980s, which combines the arch-conservative element of fiscal austerity, capitalism, and military imperialism to create something new and fun. A full embrace of the idea of free market capitalism, as well as the foreign wars, which marked the first three major neocon administrations, being the Reagan, Bush 41, and Bush 43 administrations, all are hallmarks of neoconservatism. Of note here is how the path toward foreign intervention is cleared through our own military, as well as through funding and arming local military coups, then at which point, Western businesses and economists are brought in to capitalize on the situation. So, in short, neoconservatism is the combination of small government to amplify capitalism and, foreign interventionism to, again, amplify capitalism by expanding the resources that are available to capitalist enterprises.
All right, so we're gonna shift and talk about libertarianism now. So one of the things about libertarianism is that it can span the spectrum from left to right. Then that's not to say that it sits in the center either, right? It just means that it can adopt right-wing policies or more left-wing policies. So the philosophy upholds liberty as the core concept, and libertarians are anti-government, or at least skeptical of authority, and seek to maximize political freedom and autonomy. Libertarianism emphasizes individualism, freedom of choice, and voluntary association. So there are some socialist and anarchist aspects of libertarianism, as you can tell through that definition. Libertarians diverge on their beliefs of economic and political systems, capital, and property. So, and that's why libertarianism can span the spectrum of the left-right political positioning. So it originated as a left-wing political belief along the lines of socialism and communism, anti-capitalism, and a belief in cooperative ownership, right? So they believed that private property was a barrier to liberty and to freedom. Now, I think it's also important to point out that liberty as a main party ideal in 1789, when libertarianism was first discussed, may or may not have included everyone. So the right-wing libertarian philosophy advocates for like a laissez-faire, free market capitalism, civil liberties, strong private property rights, and an end to the welfare state. And this is the dominant libertarian school of thought in the United States, a focus on the individual and individual rights. So in this country, libertarianism is really much more of a right-wing conservative ideal as opposed to like a left side of the spectrum, though I'm sure those folks are definitely out there, but it's just not really like the party platform. So the U.S. Libertarian Party platform is to protect individual rights, including private property. However, we know that when identities are added to the mix, certain individual rights are held in greater esteem than others, despite hiding behind a live and let live ideal. And I say that because in this country, libertarians are often conservatives, right, who like also embody everything that Kwadjo just mentioned. So it's a very much live and let live for my beliefs, but not a live and let live for all the beliefs, right, whether or not they affect me. Additionally, free market capitalism fucks people over and discriminates against certain people and benefits others, right? And so that is not a live and let live philosophy by any means, because there's a lot of people who are not living based on that.
Right. And, I personally think that libertarianism is a really interesting concept. I mean, for a lot of reasons. As a concept, as an ideology, at its core, is something to strive for. Julie and I were talking about this the other day. It's very much like Taoism, right? If Taoism was to manifest in one of these ideologies we've covered so far, it would probably be libertarianism or anarchy, really. It's debatable, but put that in the comments. Which one do you think it would be? Taoism? Would it be? What would it be?
Also, if you're a libertarian, put that in the comments, and please help me understand what it means for you to be a libertarian.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. But I think it's one of those things. It's a really good example of how a good idea, a good concept, one, can be skewed and essentially bastardized to mean something completely different, right? Because when I hear it, right, like, anyway, I'll get to that later. But two, it's also a really good example of how a good idea in the wrong time is a bad idea, So, like, the idea of promoting personal liberty is always a great idea. And everyone's doing that in their own way, right? Conservatives say we'll promote personal liberty by keeping the government completely out of our business, but also except for when we need them to step in to like promote our business, to have our interests in mind. Libertarians essentially say promote personal liberty by keeping them completely out of our business for everything, to an extent, and they'll go in there, they'll be like, these are my personal beliefs, but this is what I believe as a libertarian. And then liberals say, promote my personal interests by like using the government as a lever for like defending those personal interests, which makes a lot of sense because in this country, the government has dropped the ball on like the on paper personal interest. So libertarianism, it's just one of those, right? For the current time, it's not the prescription, and really conservatism is not either. And the way liberalism is applied, in mainstream is also not, but it's closer, right? Because if we look at the government and we say, okay, the government does have all this power in our lives, and businesses also have all this power in our lives, and the people, without some sort of representative body, cannot hold these businesses accountable. So who's going to do that? We're going to let the businesses do it themselves? That's what the conservatives and libertarians would have us do, and it's not going to work. We've tried that, and it hasn't worked.
Yeah, it feels a lot like libertarians are the not racist group in the United States, right? They're not anti-racist and they're not racist because they don't believe in bigotry, but they're also not, willing to do anything else for it because they believe that like individual liberties are so important, so that like every race in this country is like every person of any race has the right to individual liberties, and when those liberties are infringed upon, like then what? Like that's always kind of the question, right? Is like
just something to think about is as far as ideology is concerned, ideology concerns itself with theory and practice. And in theory, a lot of these are good ideas. We shouldn't need a government to tell us what to do and how to do it, right? We shouldn't need a government to protect us. We should be able to protect ourselves. But in practice, it's unreasonable to expect that. That's not where we are, right? Like you can have that be the like long-term end goal or a long-term goal, but in the short term, we do need these things from government. We do need these things from our elected leaders, right? So what are we going to let those things be, and how are we going to get to the point where, like, Julia's saying, all these things are secured?
I would be willing to try it in lieu of what's happening right now. Yeah, just like a couple of years, if we could have this instead of the shit that's happening right now. I don't know. I think it's all terrible, but here we are.
Boom. So we're going to end, ideologically with neoliberalism. And unlike libertarianism, which, liberty, but falls in the center again because it's composed of so many different ideas that, or interpretations that kind of balance it out in a way. Neoliberalism, we're going to count that squarely as a right-wing concept because it is capitalism adapted to the aesthetics. I mean, that's how I'll put it. It's capitalism adapted to the aesthetics of liberalism, right? So, in short, neoliberalism, as Julia mentioned earlier, is a sort of socialism for the rich. And what it is essentially a system of policies and platforms and the representatives who maintain it, agents who maintain the system, which advocate for free market capitalism. But, as we've already mentioned, that capitalism, free market capitalism, is not self-regulating, and it doesn't do so effective to whatever extent that I'm wrong, and it is, right? It's not effective at that. It collapses. 3 major economic downturns in the past 20 years alone, okay? Including this one, which we're in now, which is on track to be worse than the Great Depression that we all learned about and feared in the history books. So...
stuff your money in your mattresses now, my friends.
I mean, it's not even going to be any good, right? That's the nature of the downturns, this rampant inflation. Like, get
stuff
Bitcoin.
Your jewelry in your mattresses.
Yeah, hold on to your gold. I mean, but and we could go into a whole another history thing, but right, that was one of the first things they did in the Great Depression was they had everyone turn in their gold, which was the only thing that had value. So, anyway, neoliberalism.
We don't have a lot of gold, so we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, true. I mean, I don't have any gold. Crayons,
Gold heart.
Yeah, stickers, gold heart stickers.
Heart of gold.
Yeah. Oh.
Stickers.
So, it's socialism for the rich, where you let free market capitalism reign, right? Represented by the big banks, represented by Federal Reserve spending policy. Okay, so free market capitalism, but the major check and resource that the capitalist class has under the neoliberal umbrella is the government, right? So and it's referred to as the nanny state. The government takes care of the business class. And in the West, you saw neoliberal policies emerge out of the Keynesian economics era of the Great Depression into the 50s and the 60s. And then you started to see monetary policy change around the 70s, and then Reagan, as he did with many terrible things on this list actually, took it to the next level during his administration in the 1980s with Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain. And essentially what they did, again, if you remember, with neoconservatism, shrink the reach of the government, right? You allow capitalism to expand and you shrink the reach of the government. And if you'll remember, there's this phrase associated with Reagan called Trickle-Down Economics, because he shrunk the scope of the government as far as it relates to social welfare programs. He expanded it as far as police and military is concerned. But he didn't take all the money away from the people. He kept the vested interests of the wealthy minority in mind by giving them vast sums of money, right? Injecting the money. And his idea was that if you inject money into the upper classes, right, you give the 1% billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, enough money is going to trickle down to the people at the bottom of the pyramid. And that's it. That's how you keep the economy afloat. I mean, it's a terrible idea. I'm not sure who thought that would work. Besides, everyone in the Reagan administration, they might have been too distracted with the war on drugs. But the point is, this is neoliberalism in a nutshell. It's really everything you need to know about it. And it comes with a host of supporting ideologies including Neo-Individualism, which is the idea, again, based on, anyway, Neo-Individualism is this idea that like the self is the fundamental unit of society, right? And it can exist outside of other things, outside of family units, outside of social units, right? Because if you break down social constructs, collective constructs, into those individual components, then the allegiance is to the market, and it's not to all of these other groups. Objectivism, promoted by Ayn Rand, is another one of those dominating ideologies associated with neoliberalism, in which essentially selfishness is glorified as a virtue. And how that manifests is, again, in the capitalist classes, the upper ranks of the capitalist classes, it's essentially an ideology that says that you go do you at any cost possible and don't let anyone, tell you otherwise. So if you're a wealthy industrialist who owns a railroad company, or rather if you're Jeff Bezos, right? Like, he's classic objectivist. He's accumulated as much as he can. So like, he's the most virtuous person through the objectivist lens in the world, right? And the fact that he doesn't pay his workers enough for them to be able to take care of themselves, the fact that he doesn't pay his workers enough and he works them to the bone, the fact that he, ruthlessly runs his competitors out of business, the fact that he steals data from his, competitors to like build his own products to run them out of business, that doesn't reflect poorly on him. It reflects on him as a virtue. So again, objectivism in this sense, and then neoliberalism, given individualism and objectivism as primary central components of that, and social components. Those aren't even economic components. Those are social components, as in this is who the neo-liberal is, right? Those represent augmented forms of capitalism, which again brings us back to the primacy of capitalism as a right-wing construct. So that's going to be about it for neoliberalism. I mean, there's a whole lot more. It's literally, yeah. I mean, yeah.
I mean, there's a whole lot more for everything, but that's plenty.
Yeah. There's a whole lot more for everything. Just, closing thoughts on neoliberalism. For me, look for it everywhere, because you'll see it everywhere. Again, a quick rundown. Small government for the people. Big government for the wealthy people at the top. Individual units of social organization. So the individualist, atomized social organization. No allegiance to a collective, because you are the individual. Your allegiance is to consumerism. That's another super critical element of capitalism and neoliberalism, right? Objectivism, multiculturalism, because neoliberalism is a global construct, right? It's all over the world now. India's paying into it. China is paying into it. Russia is paying into it. So all of these enemies of the state that the media props up are really all co-conspirators in the neoliberal agenda. That's something important to keep in mind as well.
All right, so that's going to be all the ideologies that we're going to cover. And we did want to bring in an additional term and idea called the Overton Window. And the Overton Window is the range of political ideas that the public is willing to consider and accept, which then translate to the ideas that a politician would choose to campaign on, right? So this is important in the way of how we understand the ideologies that we just shared and the ones that we will, like the other terms that we'll continue to share. Joseph Overton, who developed the idea, believed in pushing for extreme change rather than incremental change, likely because it would shift the window more, or would shift it at all, to open up conversations and minds to different possibilities, and smaller changes would eventually happen, right? As opposed to pushing for like these tiny changes, which people can kind of easily ignore. So and I guess it's also important, I mean, you can do your research on Joseph Overton and how the idea came up. I mean, there was this like think tank idea and, more information about it. So check it out for sure. But as I was reading about it, I was thinking, Haymarket Books often tweets, "A different world is possible." And so like that resonated with me in terms of this idea, right? The Overton Window posits that the government reps will make decisions within the window despite their actual beliefs of what will help their constituents, the nation, and the world in order to maintain favor, right? So this would look like a particularly progressive left-wing candidate shifting their policies more towards the center in order to maintain favorability if that's where the window was at that time. So clearly this is very limiting to considering various options and to creating change in a better world, like this idea of where the window is. I also think this is particularly relevant, right, as we're talking about the current presidential race and the idea that the progressives in the left can push Biden to the left, right? And like, we can talk, I'm not going to get into that now, but just think about, right, like some of the terms and ideas that you are willing to kind of like sit with and consider in terms of who your representatives are and like what feels kind of like a safe place for you and maybe where some other people are and how that window could start to shift or how you've even seen that window shift over the past 8 or 10 years.
Right. And, you know, one of the, like when people say, describe things or ideas in popular public discourse as radical, what they're referring to, or rather, you know, as far as the Overton window is concerned, is something towards the outside of the window. So you can think of the Overton window, if you have the political spectrum, right and left, the Overton window is kind of this sliding scale of what's in public vision, right? And right down the middle, that's perfectly acceptable. It's a little box. And towards the edges, the fringes of the box, those are radical ideas, right? So radical right ideas, radical left ideas. And, you know, the way the window has been applied in recent political history is with the Bernie Sanders campaign, right? That was the major thing that the Bernie Sanders campaign did, was move the Overton window to the left, right? Before the Sanders campaign, it was squarely in the right. It was, center. And people weren't talking really about popularly, right? People were talking about things, but these are things that are outside of the window. They weren't talking about Medicare for all. They weren't talking about the Green New Deal, really. They weren't talking about student loan, student debt forgiveness, all of these things. Then Bernie Sanders comes along, and all of a sudden, right, coronavirus comes along as well, and people see not only like did they support him before, but like that his ideas are actually necessary, that they would be beneficial, thus moving the window to the left, right? So that's what progressives are trying to do, as Julia mentioned. Hope that clarifies things for you. Again, tell your friends, like, subscribe, share to this channel. Catch up on videos. We're going to be posting more videos soon. Hope this was helpful.
Yeah, stay well and take care of yourselves.
And be critical about everything. Remember, ideology is different from identity.
All right, see ya.
Take it easy. Oh, and vote for Miriam in the runoffs if you live in DeKalb County. On August 11th, coming up. Let's get it. Also, shout out to Fernanda for, hooking me up with this shirt. Shout out to Moran for, still watching this show. What's up? And, peace.